In this study, we're going to learn that only a small remnant of people will be saved during the Great Tribulation. How can we know that only a few people will be saved in the lead up to Christ's return? Well, first, we must begin with the understanding that God's salvation program is based on election. And the very fact of election means that God has chosen a few people to become saved, and he chose them, according to Ephesians chapter 1, before the foundation of the world. But when we consider the word few in relation to the few that God plans to save, we see that God provides the conditions whereupon he will save his elect. For example, in Luke chapter 13, verse 23, we read, "Then said one unto him, Lord, are there few that be saved?" Jesus responds to this question by setting the following conditions for the few who are going to be saved. He says, "And he said unto them, Strive to enter in at the strait gate, for many, I say unto you, will seek to enter in, and they shall not be able." So that is a major condition that God sets for saving his elect. He's letting us know that if we do not try to enter in through the strait gate, and the strait gate, of course, refers to Christ, who is the gate. He is the door. There is a narrow way unto salvation. But if we don't follow that narrow way and begin to go towards the broad way, God is saying that that way is going to lead to destruction. And we're going to see in our next passage regarding the few that will be saved is that God is referring to those who try to become saved by their own righteousness, that is, by their own works. So this brings us to Luke chapter 18, where God is using a widow as an example of his elect who will be alive when Christ returns. In Luke 18, verse 7, we read, "And shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry day and night unto him, though he bear long with them? Nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on earth?" Now, this is a very ominous statement, because God is giving us the impression that there's only going to be a few people when he returns. And so we're going to have to continue on studying the rest of the Bible to see if this is supported in other places in the Bible. But we know one thing, that God is setting a condition of this situation in the following verse, in verse 8 of Luke 18. There we read, "And he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others." So that's the condition for Christ coming at a time when there's going to be very little faith on earth. It is based on the fact that there are going to be many in the church and in the world who are trusting in themselves through their own righteous works for salvation. And as we learned in Luke chapter 13, the only way we can become saved is if we are following the narrow way. But if we're following the broad way, which most people in the world are following, which teaches that we can do something to save ourselves, like accepting Jesus or being baptized in water or any other work, God is saying that when he returns, there's going to be little faith on earth. Okay, so if that's true, we should find other examples in the Bible which indicate that not only few will be saved in the lead up to the coming of the Son of Man, but that few will be saved. Well, we find two examples in the Bible that speak about the time when the Son of Man is going to come. And that concerns the days of Noah and the days of Lot. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 37, Jesus compares his coming with the days of Noah. There we read, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Then, skipping down to verse 39, God talks about the judgment that comes when the Son of Man returns. "And knew not," that is the unsaved, "until the flood came and took them away, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Now we know when we examine the days of Noah that only 8 people were saved by the time that the flood came. That's not to say that there weren't people saved some years before Noah's family entered in the ark. But God is simply saying that by the time that he returned, by the time that he brought judgment, there is only a few who will be saved. In fact, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20, God says that it was only a few. There we read, "Which sometimes were disobedient, once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was preparing, wherein few," that is 8 souls, "were saved by water." So again, my friend, this matches what we read in Luke chapter 18, where God also speaks about the coming of the Son of Man. Will he find faith, or will there just be a few people who will be saved? Now that brings us to the second example concerning the days of Lot. In Luke chapter 17, verse 28, we read, "Likewise, as it was in the days of Noah, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed." Now again, we know that the days of Lot was a time when Lot and his 2 daughters left Sodom, and God destroyed all of the young and the old in the various 5 cities that included Sodom. Worse, God uses Lot's wife as an example of those who left Sodom, which is a picture of the church, but they weren't saved because they disobeyed God's command to look back. And when we consider the context of the verse where God says to remember Lot's wife, we find that she represents those who were not prepared to give their life for Christ or the gospel's sake. And that is precisely what we see in the churches today. So God is giving us some very clear examples to help us to understand that, yes, Luke chapter 13 is true when it says that there's only going to be a few who go the narrow way, and the unsaved will not be able to enter because they are headed towards the broad way which leads to destruction. Moreover, Luke chapter 18 plainly says that Christ will not find faith on earth because the vast majority of people are going to be trusting in themselves for salvation, except for God's elect, whom God is using as an example, the widow. And we know from our previous lessons that the widow represents those whom God plans to save, but they're not saved. And that's why God is saying that there's a period of time before Christ returns when there are still God's elect, but it's not very many of them. And of course, this agrees with the principle that many are called, but few are chosen. In other words, the call of the gospel does go into the world. And yet God tells us that there's only a few who are going to be saved. And this is precisely why God said in Matthew chapter 24 that he had to shorten those days of tribulation for the elect's sake. That is, for those poor widows who will be persistently pleading to God for salvation. Okay, so if the Bible is teaching that only a few people are going to be saved in the lead up to Christ's return, why does verses like Revelation chapter 7 teach that a great multitude is going to be saved out of the Great Tribulation? We learn about this in Revelation chapter 7, verse 9. There we read, "After this, that is after the 144,000 were sealed, I beheld, and lo, a great multitude, which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and peoples and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands." Then skipping down to verse 14, God plainly states that this great multitude will come out of the Great Tribulation. There we read, "And I said unto him, Sir, thou knowest. And he said to me, These are they which came out of the Great Tribulation and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb." Now, one very important clue about who the great multitude represent concerns the phrase, "no man can number." And we know that this phrase is used in the Old Testament with regard to the promises that God made to Abraham. For example, in Genesis chapter 13, God is promising Abraham that his seed would become a great nation which no man could number. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 13, beginning in verse 16. "And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered." This idea is also repeated in Genesis chapter 15, where God is speaking about the stars being innumerable. There we read, "And he brought him forth abroad and said, Look now toward the heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said, So shall thy seed be." Now, who does the seed represent? Well, we know in Galatians chapter 4 that God plainly states that the seed is Christ. And so when we think about the promises that God has made to Abraham, we know that those promises are based on the fact that we will become saved through Christ. And so, back in Revelation chapter 7, God is using the 144,000, which are of the tribes of Israel, to remind us that we need to go back to the Old Testament to learn about Jacob and the tribes of Israel and the promises that were made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That is where God wants us to focus when we think about the 144,000 who will be saved over the past 13,000 years. And as we have learned in Romans chapter 9, God refers to his elect as the children of promise. And he's using Jacob to remind us that this is part of God's election program. Let's turn to Romans chapter 9. In verse 9 we read, "For this is the word of promise. At this time I will come, and Sarah shall have a son. Not only this, when Rebekah also had conceived one, even by our father Isaac. For the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth." So we see that God's salvation program is typified in the lives of Isaac, Jacob, and Abraham. They were the children of promise. They are the 144,000 tribes of Israel that God is speaking about in Revelation chapter 7. The elect also refer to the widow that we learned about in Luke chapter 18. And so God is saying that when he returns, will he find faith? Because remember, the 144,000 were sealed before the Great Tribulation began. They include all of God's elect that he had been saving over the past 13,000 years. But when we think about the widow, we know that she represents the elect of God who will be saved just prior to the return of Christ. Now, how is this all going to work out if these people are coming out of the Great Tribulation? Well, God gives us the answer in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, in verse 16, where God is speaking about two groups of people who will be saved or raptured immediately after the tribulation, as we read in Matthew chapter 24. So let's examine 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, where God speaks about these two groups. In verse 16 we read, "For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first." So this first group refers to the 144,000 whom God had been saving before the Great Tribulation began. Most of them, or the preponderance of them, had died several years before the Great Tribulation began. And so God is saying that these people will be resurrected first. Then he tells us in the next verse about those who remain alive on earth and did not die. Verse 17 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. "Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with him." So this is the group that God is typifying as the widow. She will be on earth at a time when there appears to be little faith, because the vast preponderance of people in the world will be trusting in themselves. They reject the fact that God has elected his people from the foundation of the world. They despise the idea that God chose Jacob and he hated Esau before the twins were even born. And that, my friend, is why God says there's only a few who are going to follow the narrow way. The vast majority of people are going to go the broad way, which leads to destruction. They prefer to trust in their own works for salvation. They think that because they accept Jesus or were baptized in water or any other work, that those works make them righteous before God. So we know that there is not going to be 200 million people saved during some short period of the Great Tribulation. It's quite evident that there are not many true believers in the world. There never have been many believers whom we could fellowship with. Oh, sure, we thought we were fellowshipping with a lot of believers when we were in the church. But as God began to bring the believers out of the church, we find that very few came out. And we find that very few accept the tenets of the true gospel. And that's why there's not much faith on earth as Jesus told us there would not be. Okay, so with all of that in mind, let's go over what we have learned over the previous years regarding the timeline of God's salvation/judgment program. We know that God's judgment began in the year 1994 when Satan was loosed to execute judgment on the church. It was at that time that the abomination of desolation was set up and the daily was removed to indicate that God is no longer using the church to evangelize the world. We also know that the 144,000 of the 12 tribes of Israel were sealed before God executed his judgment. Then, according to Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, over the next 2,300 days, the church became desolate, and the Bible says they began to cast down the truth. And that's precisely what happened from 1994 to the year 2000 AD. And then, according to Daniel chapter 8, at the end of that 2,300 days, the believers will begin to cleanse their temple by removing all of the idols and the high places, which represent works gospels or attempts to become saved by our own works. And again, remember, that's why God says there will be very few that have faith on earth when he returns. But we know that the true believers will begin to increase in faith as God increases their knowledge, according to Daniel chapter 12. And they will begin to turn away from these false gospels. And that, my friend, is the purpose of the latter rain, as James 5 indicates. It is the time when we begin to turn from error to truth. And in verses like Daniel chapter 11, God uses those of understanding as examples of those who will fall sometime during the Great Tribulation. And yet God is saying he's going to give them a little help so that they will begin to make correction. And we learned some time ago that this little help is given to help us recover from some of the errors that we made regarding the timing of Christ's return. In that regard, we did not understand the 2,300 days vision, which was between 1994 and the year 2000 AD. We didn't understand that information because God had sealed up, he closed up that vision. But it is only as we continue through this time of latter rain that God begins to lead us to truth. And that's why we now understand that the parable of the fig tree is pointing to the years 1994 and the year 2017. We also learned that Sarah is used as a picture of the New Jerusalem, which will likely be revealed in the year 2017. But in the meantime, we still have the hope of salvation as we come before God like the persistent widow. But if we come to God trusting in our own righteousness, thinking that we were saved because we accepted Jesus, circumcised, or because we fast so many times during the week, or we even are water baptized, God is saying that we are on the road to destruction. We will not be raptured with that last group whom God is going to save in the lead up to Christ's return.